declare an emergency. We've got loss of power on both engines when it's loss of fuel.
Bearan 2 Delta Foxtrot, is your number 1, runway 31, clear to land air G113.
Okay, clear to land 310.
That's audio from a Piper Baron, which had a rare dual-engine failure at my home airport earlier this month. The pilot crashed short of the runway but survived, and we'll talk more about that accident during our main topic. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. Today we'll be talking about a recent accident that was most likely caused by misfueling, and we'll talk about the many different ways that your aircraft could get misfueled. We'll also talk about the steps that you should take every time you get fuel to make sure that you don't get misfueled. In our last episode, 202, we talked about my neighbor Clancy Prevost, the 9/11 hero who spoke up about Zacharias Moussaoui, the 20th 9/11 hijacker, because something didn't quite seem right. So if you didn't hear that episode, you should check it out. This week in the news, a private pilot aids a police pursuit, and zooming kills yet another pilot, and a pilot who you might have thought should know better violated a TFR in New York. All this and more, and the news starts now. From KUTV.com, that's a TV station out of Salt Lake City, private pilot helps St. George police with pursuit. Now, St. George is in southern Utah. It says, a private airplane pilot who happened to be flying above a vehicle pursuit called dispatchers after seeing an officer get stuck in a dirt road and lose the suspect in the dust in Washington County. The suspect caught the attention of a St. George police officer just after midnight. In a probable cause statement, the officer said the Volkswagen Beetle was stopped and accelerated heavily, causing the tires to lose traction and squeal. The officer saw the suspect, identified as Colton Richmond, 23, drive erratically onto southbound Interstate 15. The Beetle then abruptly exited Interstate 15 at exit 4. The officer followed the car through a roundabout and activated his flashing emergency lights. The Beetle seemed to begin pulling over and then took off again, making a U-turn as Richmond looked the officer directly in the eyes, the probable cause statement says. Quote, at that point, it became apparent to me that the vehicle was fleeing now, the officer said. The officer turned around and saw the Beetle driving the wrong direction through the second of two roundabouts. The officer pursued and saw a female passenger looking at him through the Beetle's rear window. As the high-speed pursuit continued, with Richmond sometimes slowing as if he were going to stop before accelerating again, the officer was informed by dispatch that a woman had called in to say there were children in the car and police needed to stop the pursuit. In a second call, the woman asked for help and the sounds of a struggle were heard over the phone. The suspect led the officer onto a rocky dirt road and the Beetle seemed to suffer damage from low clearance. The officer said the chase continued until he accidentally drove off the road after being blinded by all the dust being kicked up during the pursuit. As I became stuck, he wrote, I was told by dispatch that there was a citizen flying a private airplane above me, the officer's report says. The pilot called into dispatch and began relaying information about seeing my vehicle as well as the suspect vehicle. As I attempted to get my vehicle back onto the road, the pilot told dispatch that the vehicle stopped and the driver took off running. The woman told the police that she was getting a ride from Richmond to Cedar City. Her identity was not released. Police said they found many syringes filled with what they suspected was heroin on the floor of Richmond's car. Officers said they learned Richmond had one active no-bail warrant issued by the Board of Pardons and multiple drug convictions since 2014, which he was charged for. He was also arrested on charges of reckless driving, driving on a denied driver's license, failing to stop or respond at command of police, and a number of other charges. From flyingmag.com, is eVTOL the next big thing? One venture capitalist says no. Flying Magazine owner Craig Fuller wrote an article in which he shares one venture capitalist contrarian view of the next generation of aircraft. He wrote, I spend a lot of time with venture capitalists, VCs, in Silicon Valley. Recently, one of my VC friends that is heavily involved in mobility technology saw one of my tweets about eVTOL, that would be electric vertical takeoff and landing, and he sent me an email challenging my comments that the eVTOL revolution was upon us. He gave me permission to publish his comments, but asked that I not reveal his name. His comments to me, quote, saw your tweet on eVTOL companies and was wondering if there's something I'm missing in these, he said. We've looked at a dozen or more of these companies so far and struggle with some significant obstacles. And the note lists a number of different things. They mention new airframe certification with the FAA is costly and very long. It's often 5+ years and costs hundreds of millions of dollars. Compared to other forms of mobility, air mobility is uniquely subject to FAA fuel reserve requirements. For fixed-wing aircraft, it's 30 to 45 minutes of additional fuel. For helicopters, it's 20 to 30 minutes. I don't know where this will shake out with eVTOL, but it does add to range limitation. And battery degrades over time, often 20% within 2 to 4 years. We wonder if these aircraft will have sufficient reliable range for the use cases without having to overbuild the battery too much. Battery storage is getting safer, but air mobility requires a lot of cell density on an aircraft. And they mention electric powertrains require infrastructure and fast charging capabilities. Even so, uptime of vehicles is limited if they're stuck charging for extended periods. And it says most fast charging is good for charging to 80%. But if your range needs plus the FAA fuel reserves require recharge to 100%, that is a far more lengthy downtime. And skipping around here, it says pilot supply is generally not going up, and we're not sure what type of certificate a pilot would need for these. Just as an example, there are about 1,400 rotorcraft pilots in the U.S., but 33% aren't instrument rated. This, of course, ignores fixed-wings pilots, and that may be inappropriate as eVTOL may be a case where there's a broad appeal to this audience and transferability of skills and license exist. Even still, I'm not sure the commercial pilot market is big enough to make an intercity or regional air mobility service at scale possible. In LA, a city known for its sunshine and horrible traffic, the weather data shows that IFR is still required on something like 22% of days. If you have pilots that can't fly IFR, you can't provide a reliable transportation service people can count on. Noise pollution may severely limit the locations that hubs can be placed to support user demand. Road traffic is 60 dBs. A helicopter is more than 100 dB at takeoff and 89 dB at 1,500 feet. If people aren't willing to pay a premium over, say, Uber Black, it's hard to see a vehicle that has no greater passenger capability and a far higher capital expenditure and labor price point ever makes sense at scale. We're a little surprised to see a space that has technical risk, go-to-market risk, and consumer behavior risk get as much attention and capital as it has. And I was happy to read this because I totally agree. To me, the hype around the eVTOL market feels like what we saw around the light jet market nearly 20 years ago, and only a few of those jets ever made it to market. And I just have a hard time seeing how these multi-million-dollar vehicles can earn enough revenue to provide a good return on eVTOL investment. So yes, I'm sure a few of these eVTOL companies will survive, but it sort of reminds me of the early 1980s when there were 100 companies all planning to get a 25% share of the disk drive market. From generalaviationnews.com, lesson learned, don't look at the checklist while taxiing. Now, this is an excerpt from a report made to NASA's ASRS, the Aviation Safety Reporting Service. The pilot wrote, chain of events, ground cleared me to taxi from FBO, taxi to runway X via taxiway 1, taxiway 2, taxiway 3, and cross runway XY. On taxiway 3, approaching runway XY, I was looking down at my checklist. When I looked up, I was startled to see a regional jet on relatively short, perhaps 1 mile final for runway YX. After I crossed the runway, the regional jet landed without incident. Human performance considerations. First, when taxiing, one needs to be focused outside the airplane. When approaching a runway, slow to look for landing departing traffic. If I had seen the regional jet earlier, I may have either increased taxi speed, determined no speed change was required, or called ground and advised that I would be waiting for landing traffic. With the pandemic, until recently, commercial air traffic has been significantly reduced. Tower personnel may have been reduced as well. I believe one controller was handling ground and tower. With activity picking up, ATC needs to be staffed appropriately as well. Primary problem, quote, human factors. And again, I agree. This really is a pet peeve of mine. Too many people bend metal because they're doing multiple things while taxiing. If you need to do something while you're taxiing, then stop the airplane and continue when you're done. And regarding ATC staffing, about a week ago, one of my clients told me that he flew to Santa Barbara, and when he started up to fly back later in the day, he found that there was nobody staffing ATC at Santa Barbara. So there was no ground, no ATIS, no clearance delivery, no tower. And that continued for apparently 3 hours. So he ended up getting a clearance through LA Center. From flyingmag.com, the danger of irrational exuberance. This is a story about zooming. The pilot, age 40, was an instrument flight instructor and held a commercial certificate with airplane single-engine and multi-engine land ratings and an instrument rating. He had something over 1,400 hours and made his living giving flight instruction. He mostly flew a Cessna 172, but he bought a home-built Poberezny Acrosport 2 from its builder. On a Thursday, he made his first flight in the Acrosport, taking it once around the pattern. After landing, he taxied back to his hangar, spun the airplane around 3 times and shut it down. The engine ran like $1,000,000, he told his uncle, who was watching, and the controls were very responsive. He was happy with his purchase. A pilot with whom Jack shared hangar space talked with him the following day. They discussed the first flight, and the pilot asked out of curiosity, "What's the Acrosport stall speed?" Jack replied that he didn't know because the airspeed indicator was out of view and he couldn't see it while piloting the aircraft from the rear seat. And the author, Peter Garrison, writes that most likely what Jack meant was not that he could not see the airspeed indicator from the rear seat, but rather that during the landing, when the view forward is blocked by the long front end of the airplane and one orients by peripheral vision, there is no time for looking down to the instrument panel to check the speed at touchdown. Jack invited a friend who was also a pilot and had built his own experimental kitfox to go with him up on his next flight. On Saturday afternoon, he took off from runway 27, flew a wide circle, and returned for a fast pass over runway 9 at 150 feet, followed by a zoom climb. And if you haven't heard of these, this is essentially when a pilot pulls way back on the stick and starts going as near vertical as possible. There were several witnesses, and their accounts coincided. One witness had talked with Jack before the flight, and the man and his son stayed to watch. The man thought the engine was running at full throttle during the pass. He said the biplane went straight up in the air about 500 to 600 feet before its left wing dropped, and it made 2 or 3 spirals down before hitting the ground. A woman who was sitting at her campsite a quarter mile from the end of runway 9 saw the airplane going almost straight up in the air. She thought to herself, "Wow, he is really going very steep." Then she saw the left wing quickly dip down and the plane go almost but not quite straight down. Another witness mistook the drop of the left wing for a deliberate maneuver and said he doesn't have enough space to do what he's doing. Moments later, he heard the thud of the impact. All the witnesses hurried to the site of the crash 100 yards from the end of runway 9. They found both pilots dead in the crash. The NTSB's probable cause includes the pilot's decision to conduct low-altitude aerobatic maneuvers, which resulted in an exceedance of the airplane's critical angle of attack while maneuvering at a low altitude, which resulted in an aerodynamic stall. And Peter continues to write, what the probable cause surprisingly fails to mention was the pilot's lack of familiarity with the airplane. He had flown it only once before, briefly, just around the pattern. He was not used to its light stick forces. He had not stalled it at all. He had not assessed its recovery characteristics, its behavior when spinning, or its propensity for or resistance to secondary accelerated stalls. Critically, he had not ascertained the rate at which it would lose airspeed in a steep climb. He had certainly not rehearsed the zoom climb at a safe altitude in order to be sure that he knew when to pitch over and what would happen if he were late doing so. He did not know how the addition of a passenger in the front seat would affect the airplane's behavior and performance. In just about every sense you could think of, he and the airplane were strangers to one another. And then he talks about another accident where a pilot was zooming. I've never really understood why pilots do these so-called zoom maneuvers. To me, it's inherently dangerous. And I always say, if you haven't been taught how to fly a particular maneuver, then why are you making stuff up and inventing it yourself? In international news, this comes from AustralianAviation.com. Quick-thinking pilot escaped helicopter that sank while aiding bushfire crisis. A pilot was able to successfully escape their sinking aerial firebombing helicopter with just minor injuries after punching out a rear window and swimming to safety, the ATSB has found. The Garlic helicopter's UH-1H was being used to aid Australia's Black Summer bushfire season on the New South Wales south coast when it experienced a critical engine failure 100 feet above the water. According to the Safety Bureau, the UH-1H helicopter was collecting water from the Ben Boyd Reservoir to assist with bushfire operations near Eden in January 2020 when it suffered an engine failure and descended into the water. Prior to the descent, the helicopter was hovering 100 feet above the reservoir when the pilot heard a grinding noise ahead of the aircraft experiencing a total loss of engine power. On impact with the water, the helicopter's chin bubbles fragmented and the helicopter rolled inverted, filled with water, and sank. The pilot was unable to open the pilot, co-pilot, nor sliding cabin doors, causing them to finally punch out the right sliding door or rear window and escape the sinking helicopter. The pilot then inflated their life jacket and swam to shore. Before the escape, the pilot said they were able to locate a pocket of air in the cabin, allowing them to take an additional few breaths of air. The pilot later told the ATSB that their previous helicopter underwater escape training, or HUET, H-U-E-T, was pivotal to their safe escape from the sinking aircraft that day. The pilot went so far to say that they would, quote, have been dead without HUET. A teardown inspection of the helicopter later found that the engine failure was caused by inadequate lubrication to 2 main bearings in the front section of the engine. ATSB Chief Commissioner Angus Mitchell said, quote, research into helicopter overwater accident survival consistently reports drowning as the leading cause of fatalities due to the inability of the occupant to hold their breath long enough to escape. Helicopter Underwater Escape Training, or HUET, provides a learning environment for the essential skills of maintaining orientation, location, and operation of exits. And here's another helicopter story. This comes from nugget.ca, which is a Canadian website. Pilot charged with flying helicopter impaired. A 56-year-old man from Newfoundland has been charged with operating a helicopter while impaired. The accused, whose name has not been released, faced one count of impaired operation and another count of refusing to provide a sample. Shortly after 7 p.m., North Bay Police responded to the Jack Garland Airport in response to a report of a helicopter operating in a, quote, erratic manner, a statement from police said. Police say the accused, who was the only occupant of the helicopter, made an unscheduled stop at the airport. When police arrived, the helicopter landed in an unapproved area of the airport, police say, and the pilot was arrested for impaired operation. The accused also later refused to provide a suitable sample of his breath. The accused remains in custody pending a bail hearing at the North Bay Courthouse. And from usatoday.com, pilot in New Mexico hot air balloon crash that killed 5 had cocaine and marijuana in his system, according to the FAA. The pilot of a June hot air balloon crash in New Mexico that killed him and 4 passengers had marijuana and cocaine in his system at the time of the crash, according to an FAA report. The pilot, Nicholas Molesky, and 4 others aboard the hot air balloon died after it struck a power line, causing fire, and crashed into a busy street on June 26, about 6 miles west of the Albuquerque International Sunport. A 2-page forensic toxicology report by the FAA shows Molesky had marijuana and cocaine in his system at the time of his death. The hot air balloon crash was the deadliest in New Mexico's history. Albuquerque is a center for hot air ballooning in the U.S. and hosts a 9-day event every October that draws crowds of hundreds of thousands from around the world. Witnesses said the hot air balloon's envelope, the part of the aircraft that appears to be the balloon, separated from the basket after it hit the power lines. The envelope floated away and was found miles away from the crash site. From the MercedSunStar.com, now you're probably going to wonder how this story is connected to aviation, but I'll get to that in a second. Northern California woman gets probation in January 6th Capitol riot, ordered to stay out of D.C. A federal judge in Washington, D.C. agreed Friday to grant probation to a Northern California woman rather than impose up to 6 months in custody. The U.S. District Court judge sentenced Valerie Elaine Erke of Arbuckle to 3 years of probation and 120 hours of community service and ordered her to pay $500 in restitution. Her attorney, Robert Hawley, told the judge that Erke, a home designer, has, quote, been punished about as much as anyone could be punished. 3 of her bank accounts, 2 personal savings and checking accounts, and 1 business checking account were closed after she was charged, and her student pilot certificate was revoked, Hawley and Erke said. Now, I thought that was fascinating. It hadn't occurred to me that one could lose their pilot certificate due to a misdemeanor. Certainly, it's well documented that pilots can lose their pilot certificate for certain felonies, especially those that are drug and alcohol related, but I had never heard of a certificate being revoked for a misdemeanor. And finally, from avweb.com, West Point 182 busts a UN TFR. A Cessna 182 operated by the U.S. Military Academy at West Point violated a TFR associated with a meeting of the UN General Assembly in New York City. According to NORAD, the aircraft was intercepted by F-16s over the Hudson River and escorted out of the TFR at around 2 p.m. local time. The incident is under investigation. West Point spokesperson Lieutenant Colonel Beth Smith said, a West Point fixed-wing aircraft flown by an Army instructor pilot conducting a cadet flight lab in support of ME-481, a civil and mechanical engineering class, briefly violated temporary restricted airspace this afternoon near the George Washington Bridge. Once they realized they had violated the airspace, they immediately left the area and returned to the airport. And in an interesting side note, and this comes from BusinessInsider.com, I read that foreign military and state aircraft are barred from staying at Port Authority airports, those would be the major airports in the New York area, overnight due to traffic and space constraints. After they've landed at a airport, such as JFK, for example, those aircraft have 2 hours to depart for another airport where they'll park while in the U.S. New York Stewart International Airport in Newburgh, New York, about 60 miles north of the UN, is a popular parking spot for foreign aircraft, given its large runway and parking availability for large aircraft. Foreign governments and militaries can request exemptions to the rule outside of UN week, the port spokesman told Insider, and an airport's general manager may grant it if traffic levels allow. But during UN week, the aviation equivalent of tipping the valet extra to keep it nearby is considered bribery. Marlene Mizzi, a former assistant airport deputy supervisor at JFK, pleaded guilty in 2019 to accepting benefits for letting aircraft stay overnight during a session of the General Assembly. She admitted to receiving free limousine rides, meals, and gifts in return for letting a Qatar state aircraft stay overnight in 2014, according to the New York State Attorney General. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, the steps you need to take every time you buy fuel to avoid a misfueling accident. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's talk about misfueling accidents. I decided to talk about this because 2 weeks ago we had an accident that occurred at my home airport of Palo Alto, California, which was almost certainly a misfueling accident. Fortunately, the pilot survived. And this past week, I flew a brand new Diamond DA-42 for 2 hours, as I'll be doing the checkouts of other CFIs who want to teach in that aircraft at the West Valley Flying Club. And since there have been a number of misfueling incidents and accidents with the DA-42 aircraft, I decided to do a little more research on this topic. First, let's listen to the audio from the accident at Palo Alto. I've removed many of the spaces and non-relevant communications to shorten the time it takes to listen to it, but the entire flight lasted only a couple of minutes. Here's that audio from liveatc.net.
Bearing 2 Delta Foxtrot, right down Barton departure, runway 31 clear for takeoff, no delay. Bearing 2 Delta Foxtrot, early right crosswind is approved for slower traffic at 12 o'clock and 1 mile, altitude indicates 500.
Okay, we'll turn now to the Foxtrot.
Bearing 2 Delta Foxtrot, squawk 4230, that's 4230.
Okay, 4230.
Bearing 2 Delta Foxtrot, contact NorCal approach next 125.35.
575. Palo Alto Bear 162 Delta Foxtrot. We're going to have to return to the airport. We got a little right engine problem.
Bearing 2 Delta Foxtrot, enter right downwind.
Delta Foxtrot. Declare an emergency. We've got loss of power on both engines. Want to about the fuel.
Bearing 2 Delta Foxtrot, your number 1, runway 31 clear to lander G113.
Okay, clear to land 312 Delta.
Still want me to land? You want me to go around? Saratoga 3 Tango Charlie, go around, extend upwind. Go around, extend upwind, 2
9 Hotel Zulu, that aircraft looked like that aircraft just crashed and did not make it.
9 Hotel Zulu, roger.
9 Hotel Zulu, I just saw that aircraft not make it on right base.
9 Hotel Zulu, roger, we're working on it. Top Bearing 162 Delta Foxtrot, Delta Tower. Palo Alto Tower, this is Husky 8 Hotel Yankee. We can do a circle to find that crash aircraft if you need us to. Andrew, sorry, we can do that. Husky 8 Hotel Yankee, we have aircraft closer to it that can look, thank you. Bearing 162 Delta Foxtrot, Delta Tower. Cessna 6 Mike Echo, affirmative, but we're going to be shutting down pattern work for now.
Cessna 9 Hotel Zulu, you can make a right turn on Yankee. What is safe parking?
I'm Reno Row, which is just ahead of me, so I can just continue up ahead if that's okay with you.
Affirmative, sorry about that. I thought you were in the road.
No, it's all good. I hope that guy's okay, by the way. 9 Hotel Zulu.
Yeah, we hope so too. Thank you.
Double engine failures are very rare, but when they occur, they're often the result of misfueling of an aircraft. We don't yet know the cause of this accident, so I wrote to Patreon supporter Tom Turner, who's the executive director of the American Bonanza Society Air Safety Foundation, and asked him if Barons have been misfueled with Jet A in the past. He wrote, "Yes, misfueling has brought down more than one Baron off the end of the departure runway. We had a fatal one of these here at Wichita Jabra Airport several years ago. The pilot landed wheels up in a flat field, but he did not have shoulder harness, and both he and his passenger died from head trauma in an otherwise very survivable landing. Depending on the vintage of the Baron, another dual-engine failure scenario that has happened is when both fuel selectors are in the aux position for takeoff, or if one of the engines is in crossfeed while the other is on, so that both engines run a single wing dry. And later he wrote, I saw a photo and it's a 58p pressurized Baron. It does not have independently selectable auxiliary fuel tanks, so that possibility is ruled out. It may be that one engine was on crossfeed, but the takeoff fuel level would have to have been pretty low to drain a wing empty on takeoff. I suspect misfueling. Well, like most accident types, misfueling accidents are almost always preventable, but they require an attention to detail by both pilots and by fuelers. And pilots, most of us are not paying enough attention to the fueling. The AOPA Air Safety Institute has a safety brief called Misfueling, and here's what they wrote in part. Why do misfueling incidents happen? There are many reasons, but a contributing factor in most incidents is a lack of pilot oversight. A recent survey indicated that while 67% of pilots oversee their airplane's oil changes and 50% are present when a tire is pumped up, only 39% attend the fueling of their aircraft. While this may seem surprising at first glance, it makes sense within the context of a normal fuel purchase. Think about it. How many times have you landed, jumped out of the airplane, and, in a hurry to get going, told the FBO to just top it off? For many of us, it's standard operating procedure. We assume that sumping the tanks prior to departure is insurance enough against fueling errors. That may not always be true, though. The blending of two different fuels within the tank can mask the color and smell distinctions that would normally signify a problem. Also mistaken is the assumption that a misfueled engine will fail to start or will run poorly. In many cases, the engine may seem to run normally for quite some time, long enough to lure the pilot into a false sense of well-being. So let's dig into this some more. Misfueling accidents can happen to just about any aircraft type, so please don't be complacent just because maybe you fly a Cessna 172 and you figure that everyone knows not to put Jet A into a 172, because it could happen and in ways that you probably haven't considered. There are a variety of different ways that an aircraft can get misfueled. It's not just as simple as the fuel guy making a mistake. So let's talk about these different ways. First, the most common way an aircraft gets misfueled is when a fueler makes a mistake and the pilot doesn't catch that mistake. Note that you, as the pilot, are the final line of defense to prevent the flight of an aircraft that's been misfueled. Here are some posts from the diamondaviators.net forum about aircraft types that are likely to get confused and misfuel. The original poster who started this particular thread wrote, I've owned my Piper Malibu for over 14 years, but have experienced being misfueled twice in the last 5 years. I usually try to be there when the fuel truck pulls up to the airplane, but that doesn't always happen. But over the last 14 years, the PA-46 fleet has gone from being all avgas powered to nearly half being turbine powered, as almost 600 Meridians have been delivered and nearly 300 Malibus and Mirages have been converted to jet props. I just think the average line person in some cases just assumes a PA-46 must be a turbine and fuels it incorrectly, despite the obvious lack of the huge turbine exhaust stacks. Has anyone experienced a misfueling of their diesel-powered DA-42? It certainly doesn't have the huge turbine exhaust stacks, and being a small twin, the average line person may assume it is avgas powered. I know all airplanes have stickers at their fillers indicating the correct fuel type, but many FBOs have the line person throw a rubber mat around the filler, which covers up the stickers even before noticing them. In the meantime, I've resorted to putting the fuel tape over the fillers if I cannot be there when being fueled. Someone else replied to the thread. They wrote, besides the PA-46, which is close to 50-50 avgas and Jet A, there are about 130 Cessna 210Ps converted to turbine. That would be the pressurized model. Then there are a few dozen Bonanzas that have been converted. And by the way, we have one of those converted turbine Bonanzas on our field. Then the twin market, although much smaller, gets more confusing. The Piper PA-31 series were delivered as avgas-powered models, such as the Navajo and the Chieftain, and as turbine models called the Cheyenne 1 and 2. The Cessna twins, such as the 414 and 421, were avgas-powered, but the nearly identical-looking Conquest 1 was turbine-powered. Then there are the Cessna 340s that have been converted to turbine, as well as a couple of dozen Beech Dukes that have been converted to PT6s. It seems like the best solution is better training of line personnel. All they need to do is look at the fuel placard at each filler before throwing the protective rubber mat on the wing that usually obscures the placard. Now let's talk about some of the other aircraft that can be easily confused. Let's talk about the Diamond DA-40. Now, that started out with an avgas engine, which of course requires 100 low lead, as do most single-engine piston aircraft. But in late 2002, Diamond introduced the DA-40 TDI, which looks nearly identical to the DA-40, but it uses jet fuel. Later, they started shipping the DA-40 NG, which also uses jet fuel. Now, I have at least 100 hours in that aircraft, and it's a wonderful airplane, but it looks very similar to the original DA-40, which uses avgas. Now, I was talking with a Diamond sales rep this past week, and he told me that Diamond no longer produces the 100 low-lead version of the DA-40, so all of the new DA-40s being delivered run on jet fuel. And now let's talk about the Diamond DA-42 Twin Star, which is also powered by jet fuel. Now, it's a small twin, and of course, many fuelers and pilots are used to small twins being powered by 100 low-lead. And to make it a little more confusing, early on, there actually were a few 100 low-lead powered versions of the DA-42 that were sold mostly to flight schools. So even with the DA-42, fuelers can't assume that every DA-42 they might encounter requires jet fuel, as there are a few flying that require 100 low-lead. So one of the most common ways an aircraft gets misfueled is when a fueler makes a mistake and puts the wrong type of fuel in an aircraft. But there are other ways misfueling can happen. A second way an aircraft may get misfueled is if the pilot makes a mistake while using the self-serve fuel pumps and chooses the wrong hose. A pilot wrote on the Malibu M-Class Owners and Pilots Association forum about how that could happen, and the discussion thread was about an accident that appeared to have been just that, where the pilot self-fueled with the wrong hose. And this is what he wrote. He said, "Lest anyone think this would be an impossible mistake to make, take a look at the pumps. There is one credit card keypad at the left side, and then after you swipe your card and grab hose number 1 or hose number 2, the jet filler nozzle is slightly larger than the 100 low lead, but does not have the rectangular end. Once you grab the wrong hose, there is very little to cue you to your error. Given the departure runway and the way the aircraft would be pointed following its taxi from customs, it is very likely that wind would have been blowing from leading to trailing edge, perhaps depriving the pilot of a smell cue and his last chance to catch his own air." And he finished up, "What I take away from this is a reminder that even a good and careful pilot like me or you can have a bad day or a moment of inattention with tragic results. On days when I'm not feeling right on top of my game, I will think about this accident." Now let's talk about a third way that you might be misfueled, and that can occur if the wrong type of fuel was loaded into the fuel farm or into the fuel truck. So imagine this: a correctly marked truck arrived to fill your tanks, but it has the wrong type of fuel in the truck. This report came from the NASA ASRS reporting system. A pilot wrote, "I stopped for fuel at a small southern airport, and the airport manager added 7.5 gallons to top the tanks. Total usable fuel capacity on this model is 50 gallons. I then proceeded north and made another fuel stop where the lineman added another 25.3 gallons. There was no obvious anomalies on this leg, which totaled 3.1 hours of flight time. However, the rate of climb seemed sluggish while departing from the second fuel stop, and once or twice I was aware of an unusual engine vibration. The next morning I was contacted by the airport manager at yesterday's first fuel stop and advised that after my departure, he'd learned that the delivery driver had mistakenly loaded about 5,000 gallons of Jet A into the 100 low-lead tank at his fuel farm. My best estimate after the fact is that the fuel burned between the two fuel stops may have contained a concentration of Jet A as high as 25%. Since I learned of the misfueling, the airplane has been grounded and the engine removed for a teardown inspection in accordance with Lycoming SB 398B. And so the synopsis is, a pilot PA-28 pilot reported that his aircraft engines and fuel tanks were removed for cleaning and inspection after Jet A was accidentally mixed with 100 low lead at a refueling point on the previous flight. Another NASA ASRS report describes how this happened years ago at KFIN, the Flagler County Airport in Florida, in which 8 aircraft were misfueled after Jet A was put into the 100 low lead fuel farm tank. The report says in part, "Scenario of events leading to the problem is as follows. Airport called their source for fuel and ordered 100 low lead. JAX, which I guess is short for Jacksonville, did not have 100 low lead at that time. They called another source to deliver to Flagler Airport. The driver assigned had only delivered jet fuel in his time with the company. He filled his truck with jet fuel, even though the order stated 100 low lead, delivered to the airport, and in spite of color-coded cap on underground tank, pumped jet fuel into 100 low lead tank. Driver took paperwork into office and gave them delivery sheet for 100 low-lead fuel. 4 insurance companies are currently involved in trying to settle the situation. Reporter will not rebuild and use these engines. He says he could never be comfortable with them again. And by the way, a very similar type of occurrence occurred at the Watsonville, California airport, very close to me, and this was about 25 years ago, as I recall. Jet A was accidentally put into the 100 low-lead tanks at the airport, and the fuel supplier, which I believe was Chevron, ultimately replaced about 70 engines for aircraft that had bought fuel during that time. So we've talked about 3 different ways an aircraft might get misfueled, and here's a 4th scenario, which is hopefully rare, and that is that a disgruntled employee purposely misfueled an aircraft. This report also comes from the ASRS database. The pilot wrote, "The aircraft is a twin-diesel engine Diamond DA-40, which does not have the special adapter to indicate that it requires Jet A, though it is placarded. Company had a disgruntled employee who, despite the instructional aircraft being hangared at company, placed avgas into the tanks. The school didn't have checks and balances on fueling and no new employee orientation. The tanks were 50-50 Jet A avgas, and we had burned approximately a half to 2/3 of the Jet A when company CSA noticed the wrong truck number on the ticket, confirmed the lineman did indeed put the wrong fuel in, and contacted Tower, who told us we needed to return. We were well outside Bravo, and no communication reason was provided, nor that an issue existed. It was only by mistake that we had communications with anyone since we were well outside the Tower's airspace, and the school had no flight following policy. Had the Tower communicated the event, we would have landed at another airport that was close by. While en route back, the instructor used her cell phone to find out that avgas had been used to refuel the diesel engine tanks. Planning was then instituted for dual engine failure and potential off-airport landing. At that point, XYZ was the closest airport, and the flight terminated without incident. Diamond Aircraft manufactures both diesel and avgas singles and diesel twins, with no gas intake modifications like turbines have to restrict or indicate type of fueling. This will happen again, or the reverse, with dire consequences eventually. Checks and balances on refueling on both the school and the FBO, as well as U.S. standards of fuel tank nozzles, could have prevented this. Sumping did nothing, as avgas is lighter than diesel. Synopsis: DA-42 flight crew reported aircraft was deliberately serviced with the incorrect fuel, causing an immediate diversion. And if you think that misfueling is rare, well, it's even happened to one of our guests that we've had on the show. Mike Bush, who we've had on the show twice talking about engines, wrote in AOPA in 2016, quote, "On March 2nd, 2008, a turbo-normalized Cirrus SR20 was destroyed when it crashed shortly after takeoff in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, killing all 4 people aboard. Shortly after the aircraft departed from runway 20, the airplane's engine lost power and the aircraft hit a building and exploded. Further investigation revealed that the aircraft had been refueled with Jet A instead of 100 low-lead. This report reminded me of an incident 16 years earlier during which my own 1979 Cessna T310 was misfueled with Jet A at the San Carlos, California airport, a busy GA airport just south of SFO, and I should also note just a couple of miles from where I'm sitting right now. Mike continues, "Fortunately, I caught the misfueler in the act red-handed. Had I not been lucky enough to do that, I probably wouldn't be writing this column. Normally, I either fuel my aircraft myself at a self-serve pump or watch it being fueled when avgas is supplied by truck. On this occasion, I radioed for the fuel truck and waited patiently for it to arrive. After 10 minutes of waiting, Mother Nature intervened and compelled me to walk into the terminal building in rather urgent search of a loo. By the time I took care of my pressing business and returned to the ramp, there was a fuel truck parked by my airplane in a line person pumping fuel into my right main tank. As I approached the aircraft, I observed to my horror that the truck was labeled Jet A. At first, I was not too worried because I believed that misfueling my airplane with Jet A was physically impossible. That's because in 1987, all turbocharged twin Cessnas became subject to Airworthiness Directive AD 872102, which mandated installation of restrictor ports on all fuel filler openings. The restrictor ports were designed to make it impossible to insert an industry-standard Jet A nozzle while accommodating the smaller diameter avgas nozzle. So the FAA mandated that jet fuel trucks install a wide spade-shaped fuel nozzle and that vulnerable airplanes, like the turbocharged twin Cessna, have restrictor ports installed into which the wide jet fuel nozzle would not fit. This made misfueling a piston aircraft with jet fuel theoretically impossible. But as I arrived at my airplane, I discovered that indeed my left main tank had been topped with Jet A. How was this possible? A subsequent investigation by the local FSDO revealed that the Jet A fuel truck at the San Carlos airport had not been fitted with the correct spade-type nozzle. I spent literally hours trying to find an A&P on the field that would assist me in purging the fuel system of its witch's brew of 100 low lead in Jet A. The purging process itself was quite an eye-opener. We drained the tanks as completely as possible, putting the noxious effluent into a 55-gallon drum provided by the fueling company. We disconnected the fuel line going to the engine-driven fuel pump and drained all fuel from that as well. Next, 5 gallons of 100 low lead was poured into the main tank and then pumped through the system using the electric boost pump and drained from the disconnected fuel line into a 5-gallon bucket. The fuel in the bucket was tested for Jet A contamination using the paper towel test. A few drops are placed on a paper towel and allowed to evaporate completely. Pure 100 low lead will not leave an oily ring on the towel, but even small amounts of Jet A contamination will leave an obvious ring. The stuff in the bucket flunked the test. Another 5 gallons of 100 low lead were poured into the tank and the process repeated. Once again, it flunked the paper towel test. We had to repeat the procedure 3 more times before we were satisfied that the system was essentially kerosene-free. We reconnected the fuel line, cowled up the engine. The fueling company then topped off the airplane, again gratis, and I was finally good to go, fully 6 hours after the misfueling incident. And then under lessons learned, Mike says, I learned some important lessons that day. Perhaps the most important is that it's impossible to distinguish pure avgas and a mixture of avgas and Jet A by color alone. My main tanks had been about half full of avgas, so after the misfueling, they contained roughly a 50-50 mix. If you take a jar full of pure 100 low lead and another jar of 50-50 mix of 100 low lead and avgas, I guarantee you will not be able to see any difference in color or clarity between the two. I hadn't realized that before. I had always been taught that you sump the tanks and observe the color. 100 low lead is blue and Jet A is straw color. What I was not taught is that a mixture of 100 low lead and Jet A is also blue and that you simply can't tell the difference visually. In retrospect, I shudder to think what would have happened if I had not caught the Jet A truck in front of my airplane. I was also taught that since Jet A is significantly heavier than avgas, 6.7 pounds per gallon versus 5.85 pounds per gallon, the Jet A and 100 low lead will separate just like oil and water, with the Jet A at the bottom where the sump drain is and the 100 low lead at the top. That's true, but only if the contaminated fuel is allowed to sit for hours and hours. It turns out that 100 low lead and Jet A mix quite well, and the mixture takes a surprisingly long time to separate. There are at least 2 good ways to distinguish pure 100 low lead from kerosene-contaminated 100 low lead. One is by odor. Jet A has a very distinctive odor that is detectable even in small concentrations. The other, and probably best, is by using the paper towel test. Pour a sample on a paper towel or even a sheet of white copy paper, let it evaporate, and see if it leaves an oily ring. And then in conclusion, Mike writes, what effect does Jet A contamination have on a piston engine? Enough to ruin your day. You can think of Jet A as being fuel with a 0-octane rating. Any piston engine that tries to run on pure Jet A will go into instant destructive detonation. However, in real life, we almost never encounter that situation because the tanks, at least the main tank used for takeoff, is almost never completely dry when the aircraft is misfueled. Therefore, the real-world problem is not running on pure Jet A, but on running on a mixture of 100 low lead and Jet A. Depending on the mixture ratio of the 2 fuels, the effective octane rating can be anything between 0 and 100. A mixture with a lot of Jet A and just a little 100 low lead might be detectable during run-up. A 50-50 mix might not start to detonate until full power is applied, and the engine might fail 30 seconds or 3 minutes after takeoff. Just a little Jet A contamination might produce only moderate detonation that might not be noticed for hours or even weeks. Like so many other things in aviation, it all depends. The Cirrus SR20 accident in Rio reminds us that the problem of misfueling is still with us, despite all the efforts of the FAA to eradicate it. We need to be vigilant. Always watch your airplane being fueled if you possibly can. Make sure its fuel filler ports are equipped with restrictor rings. Don't just look at the fuel you drain from your sumps. Sniff it, and when in doubt, pour it on a paper towel. Now that's a great article from Mike Bush, and I'll include a link to it in our show notes. While researching this episode, I came across many stories of misfueled aircraft, and I wish I had time to read them all. One pilot wrote, "In my 9+ years of owning a DA-42, I have had several FBOs try to put 100 low lead into my DA-42 even though there are placards all over the tanks that say Jet A only. I never let anyone fuel the plane without me being present. There is just no excuse for allowing that mistake to be made. Take the extra minute or two to make sure the correct fuel truck is putting Jet A into your plane. I have seen more than one DA-42 engine ruined after having had 100 low lead put into the tank. It is just not worth taking that risk. And finally, here are some suggestions from the AOPA safety brief that I mentioned earlier, and of course I'll include a link to it in the show notes. It says in part, there are a few simple steps that you should follow every time you fuel your aircraft. And they talk about when you order the fuel. When ordering, specifically state the fuel grade and quantity you want, e.g., please top off both tanks with 100 low lead. Get a readback of your fuel order from the FBO employee who took it. And fuel order forms are often color-coded for positive identification. Avgas is red, jet fuel is black. And by the way, those are the same colors you'll see on the fuel truck as well as on the stickers that you may find on your aircraft. Fueling. Be present at each and every refueling of your aircraft. Confirm the specific fuel grade again with the line service personnel. Actively observe the fueling process. If something doesn't seem right, speak up immediately. Match the fuel truck or fuel island color coding with the color of the wing fueling decal. The color coding is standardized. Avgas equals red, Jet A equals black. Check to see that the fuel nozzle is compatible with the aircraft's fuel filler. Avgas nozzles are small and round, while jet fuel nozzles are larger and flattened like a duck's bill at the end. Payment. When paying, verify that the fuel grade and quantity on the invoice match what you ordered. Many invoices and receipts are now distinctively marked to further identify the fuel grade delivered. Pre-flight. Visually check the tanks for quantity and fuel color. Drain a sample from each tank sup. Check for water and other contaminants, and note the fuel smell and color. 100 low lead has a light blue tint, while jet fuel is clear or yellowish in color. Jet fuel does not evaporate as quickly as avgas and has a distinctive heavier odor. If you have any doubts about the type of fuel in your tanks, do not depart. And in summary, they say, any aircraft misfueling is potentially serious, but the greatest danger for most GA pilots occurs when a gas engine is serviced with jet fuel. It is not desirable to do so, but most commercial turbine engines can be run on avgas within the limits listed in the POH. The inverse is not true. Gasoline engines cannot be run on jet fuel. Without fuel of a certain octane rating, a gasoline engine will be damaged or destroyed by detonation. Jet fuel has no special anti-detonation properties. It will quite literally cause a gasoline engine to self-destruct. During the 1970s and 80s, a rash of misfueling incidents prompted the adoption of several safety precautions, including color-coded wing and fuel truck decals and special fuel nozzles and filler openings for jet fuel. Although these steps greatly reduce the misfueling of gasoline engines with jet fuel, such incidents still need to be eliminated completely. So there you have it, all the steps that you should take every time you get fueled up to avoid being misfueled. Coming up next, my updates, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now for some updates, and then we'll get to some of your email feedback. I've just come off of 8 continuous full days of flying, which is why I was unable to get a new episode out last week. The first 5 days were flying around the western states in a brand new SF-50 Vision Jet. The owner had recently passed his Vision Jet check ride and needed to get some more hours of experience in the airplane. So we headed off to Jackson, Wyoming, where we spent 2 nights. And then we spent the next 2 nights in Watsonville, California. And some of the airports that we visited included McCall, Idaho, Santa Fe, New Mexico. We had planned to stop in Eagle County, Colorado Airport, but decided to overfly it since it had been a turbulent day and we figured it would be even worse down in the valley. On our first arrival into Jackson, we were flying the ILS using the autopilot, and at one point the turbulence rolled the aircraft about 30 degrees to the right. I was very proud of my owner, who clicked off the autopilot and continued to hand fly the approach to the ground as we were getting tossed around. We also flew into Boise, Idaho, and later Portland, where it was predictably rainy, which gave us an opportunity to work with the onboard radar. On another day, we flew into Redding, California, and picked up a trace of ice going into there, which gave us a chance to test out the aircraft's ice protection systems, which all worked well. After 5 days in the Vision Jet, I had 2 full days of flying at the Flying Club, and on the 8th day, I spent all day studying and flying a brand new DA-42, which had just arrived from the factory. It's been about 4 years since I've last flown the DA-42, and this is the new 6 version, which they use the letters VI So it's a DA42VI, which they say 6, and that has a number of speed modifications versus the earlier versions. Now, tomorrow, bright and early, I leave on a Vision jet with a local owner, another owner, and we're going to be flying back to Knoxville, Tennessee, where we'll both do our annual recurrent training in the Vision jet. If you have a type rating for any jet, the FAA requires you to do a PPC or pilot proficiency check each year, which is fairly similar to the original check ride that you take when you first get a type rating. So that's where I'll be this coming week. And here's some information that comes from Mega supporter Rick Miller. He says that the Lunken Flight Training Center, where he teaches in Cincinnati, has just announced a partnership with Purdue University Global, as students accepted into the program can get their BS degree through online training with Purdue Global, and that includes aviation and general education classes. And at the same time, they can complete their professional flight training at the Lunken Flight Training Center, or one of several other Purdue Global affiliates around the country. During flight training, the students work on certificates such as Instrument Commercial, Multi-Engine, and CFI. And if that's of any interest to you, check out purdueglobal.edu or flylftc.com. And here's a message from Peter Olison, who's a new Patreon supporter. He says, Max, thanks so much for all of your effort putting on a great GA podcast. I discovered the podcast about 6 months ago, and I've already learned so much from your commentary and guest. I only recently earned my private pilot certificate. Congratulations, by the way, on that. And I'm now working toward my instrument rating. I have 170 total hours, of which about 120 are in the Cirrus SR20 G6. He says, my ultimate goal is to one day fly a high-performance turboprop, such as a PC-12 or TBM 940, or maybe a light jet such as the SF-50. More important for me is to continue building my proficiency as I work toward this end goal. With your history flying the SR20, SR22, and SF-50, what advice would you have for me? Are there certain types of experience or even planes that you feel would best prepare me for my end goal? I'm working on my instrument rating in the Cirrus SR20, which I hope to achieve by October. After that milestone, I've been considering whether working toward a commercial rating would be a good next step or simply continue time building and training missions. Well, Peter, great. I'm happy that you have so much time in the SR20. That's going to be excellent preparation for any of the things that you've talked about. After you get your instrument rating, I'd suggest getting time in an SR22 and make sure that you fly IFR a lot, including flying both the departure procedures and arrivals in and out of major airports. And by the way, you may want to check out the October issue of Flying Magazine that just came out. The article I'm quoted in there about the SF-50, I say, in my experience, the most consistent area of focus after getting the type rating is getting pilots used to managing their descents from the flight levels. If ATC leaves them up high for too long, it usually takes newly minted jet pilots a while to realize that they may end up high and fast. Many of them will set the autopilot to descend at 500 feet per minute, which works well on piston aircraft, but is often insufficient when descending from the flight levels. Using arrival procedures properly is also a common challenge, as many IFR pilots haven't previously used arrival procedures much unless they happen to be based at a very large airport. So my advice, start flying a faster airplane and make sure you're doing lots of instrument work, especially DPs and arrivals. Thanks so much, Peter, for your letter and for your support. And here's a review that was posted on Apple iTunes, the Apple Podcast app. It says, a true aviation gem. I've been reading Max's books since training in a Diamond DA-40 decades ago. I've been impressed by his down-to-earth demeanor and ease of following along. I still have a CD of the G1000 software somewhere in my box of things. Listening to him on the Geeks podcast was always a treat, since he was the only one directly speaking to us, GA pilots in small single-engine piston aircraft. That's the sensibility he brings to this podcast. If you fly a Cirrus, even better. Every episode highlights an issue that we in the GA pilot community should be talking about. The methodical manner in which he handles these topics is truly masterful. Thanks so much, Max. And thank you so much for that review. And I'd encourage anyone else who'd like to leave a review, just go ahead out to whatever podcast player that you're using to listening to the show, and there's a place where you can leave us a review. Now, here's an article from the FAA that's on medium.com, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes. It says the FAA testing new system to increase weather information to Alaska pilots. It says now the FAA is leveraging the existing WeatherCam network to test another technology to give pilots more weather information. The new technology, called the Visual Weather Observation System, or VWOS, provides critical weather information that pilots need to fly safely into airports and landing areas where there is no current weather reporting system. Sensors attached to existing cameras provide pilots with information about visibility, wind speed and direction, temperature, dew point, and air pressure, as well as images from the camera systems. VWAS is a potential lower-cost supplement to our current highly valuable automated weather reporting stations, which provide weather data without images. Currently, we have the VWAS system at 4 airports used by several air carriers, GA pilots, and charter pilots. We're planning to evaluate the test data this fall to determine the feasibility of installing these systems in Alaska locations where there currently is no weather information. We're also rapidly expanding our weather camera system to other parts of the U.S. In 2020, 4 years after we turned on the most recent camera system in Alaska, we expanded the program to Colorado by working with the state to install them in 13 mountainous areas. Now we're installing 23 systems throughout the Hawaiian Islands and 3 in Montana. And in Mississippi and Michigan, we're working with hospitals to study how weather cameras can make emergency medical flights safer and reduce flight cancellations due to weather uncertainty. And here's some of your email. This comes from Ralph from Indiana. He wrote, Max, I enjoyed your episode on Clancy Prevost. That would have been episode 202. As a new pilot at Northwest Airlines in the 1980s, I flew with Clancy several times. He was a great pilot and an all-around good guy. He was the captain that everybody enjoyed flying with. I always looked forward to a trip with Clancy. He was also a no BS kind of guy, and I was not at all surprised by his actions in pressing for contacting the FBI about Musawi. Well, Ralph, thanks so much for your email. Here's one from Jeremy in Wisconsin. He says, Hi, Max. Enjoy the podcast. It's fun how your aviation history can come full circle. I remember in the last year I heard Diamond Star 859 Papa Alpha on Washington Center when I was en route to KJYO, and it brought back memories, as 859 Papa Alpha was one of the planes I did my primary training in back in 2003 at the now-defunct Paramount Aviation near Grand Rapids, Michigan. I was shocked to hear in your last podcast that same plane was involved in the presidential TFR intercept. And Jeremy, N numbers and airplanes are like old friends to me. It's kind of fun seeing them, and of course sometimes years go by before you see one again. I always remember 182MT because MT would be Max Trescott. It actually stood for, I think, Monmouth Toyota, because the owner of the airplane owned a car dealership back east. I saw that airplane land in Hackettstown, New Jersey, and I'll never forget it because there was a chauffeur-driven limousine, and the chauffeur was, in the uniform, waiting to pick up the owner of that 182. And then probably 30 years later, I saw the same airplane land at Reed Hillview, California, and I told the story to its owner, and he thought that was a great story. So the plane had since been sold and moved to the West Coast. Here's a message from Patreon supporter Alan Markham. He says, nice nod to you and quotes from you in the Flying Magazine's Cirrus Vision Jet article, Max. Well, thanks for that, Alan. And here's a note from Nathaniel in California. He says, Hi, Max. I recently listened to episode 202 where you asked people to try to fly with ANC or automatic noise-canceling headphones like AirPods Pro and a non-noise-canceling headset and report in. I've been flying like this as a passenger in a loud 172 for quite a while with AirPods Pro underneath Dave Clark's. In my experience, while the AirPods Pro do an excellent job at canceling engine and wind noise, they do too good a job at stopping speech, making it hard to hear ATC in the intercom. Since I'm a passenger, this is fine, but I wouldn't do this if I were flying. Well, Nathaniel, thanks so much for sharing that experience. And here's an email from Steve in Louisiana. He says, Max, I'm a longtime listener, first time reaching out. I really enjoyed the interview with Aerobridge in episode 201. As a native of Southeast Louisiana, I appreciate you putting a spotlight on what folks are going through down here right now and the efforts by organizations like Aerobridge to assist. I fly UH-60s for the National Guard and have been keeping busy assisting in my own way. It's inspiring to hear about folks using aviation to bring much-needed supplies to hard-hit areas. I also couldn't help but give a quick editing note. During the interview with Trevor, y'all discussed a few of the airports being used to deliver supplies. Those are pronounced Galeano and Homa. Asking to pronounce a name in our neck of the woods is always a loaded question. Well, Steve, thank you so much for that. And here's an email from Richard Benson. He says, this is a long overdue listener comment regarding how much I've thoroughly enjoyed your podcast over the last 11 months. I actually have gone back to the beginning and I listened to all the episodes up through 160 thus far. Even with 3,000 plus hours over the last 40 years, I continue to routinely find valuable gems, not to mention concepts I'd long forgotten, as well as getting up to speed on some of the news that passed me by. I say long overdue because way back in episodes 69 through 75, when you were broadcasting from Oshkosh in 2018, I meant to share that those exciting interviews were some of my favorite episodes with people like Jack Pelton, Vicky Benzing, Jolie Lucas, Chad and Scott, and the others. I felt like I was right there with you. So thank you for your dedication and passion and all you bring to GA. As everyone seems to agree, keep up the great work. And he says, P.S. I'm also way overdue in a PayPal contribution to support the cause. Can you kindly remind me where the PayPal button is on your website? I don't see it under Help the Show. Well, Richard, it's easy to make a donation via PayPal. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal, enter your credit card, and you can donate either on a monthly basis or a one-time donation. And, of course, you can also donate through Patreon, where you can get various goodies. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome or aviationnewstalk.com/Patreon and sign up at whatever level that you'd like. And in the last 2 weeks, just 3 new people signed up, but 2 of them are mega supporters. These are folks who donate $50 a month or more. And of course, not only do they get access to my online courses, but they also get a free book of mine after they've signed up for 2 months. One of them is Greg Campbell. He's a high-tech entrepreneur from Ottawa, and he is flying a DA-40NG, which we just talked about. That's the diesel-powered version, and he's working on his instrument rating. Also, John Sadak. I haven't heard back from him yet, but we'll tell you more about him next time. And we also had a one-time donation from Anthony Staley via PayPal. That was for $35, and he says, great show. And let me tell you briefly about our mega supporters, who include Brian Deere, who lives in Texas and just sold his Turbo 206. He's looking for a twin. Matt Souza, he's a computer engineer who worked for Embraer in Brazil before moving to Chicago. He's a student pilot at the Chicago Executive Airport, and he's getting close to his check ride. Tyson Weiss, co-founder and CEO of ForeFlight. Dave Brochet, he's retired from the Navy, recently completed his instrument rating. He's now flying Pipers and Cessnas at the Navy Flying Club in Jacksonville and thinking of buying a Cirrus next year. Kent Mazia, he and his wife Misty own a 2007 Cirrus at the Alpine Airport in Wyoming and have a passion for helping others by flying volunteer missions for Angel Flight. And Kent just emailed me recently about ezwxbrief.com, which he says is an extremely helpful tool for weather that he recommends. Victor Vogel, who lives in Central PA and flies a Cirrus. Tim Delaney, he's a wealth manager in Eagle, Idaho, and flies a Turbo SR20 out of Nampa Airport. Stephen Elop flies a 182 and a Citation CJ3+. He tells me he's just changed jobs. He's now the CEO of Digital.ai, a company focused on enterprise agile software development tools. Mike Williams, he's the president of TCB Composite. They make composite spinners and bulkheads for GA aircraft, and he flies a 172. Seth Lake, he's a DPE giving check rides, and he specializes in teaching the multi-engine rating in his 3 beach travel airs. So if you're interested in getting your multi-engine rating down in Arkansas, check out vsl.aero, which is his website. Rick Miller, who we just mentioned earlier, teaches at the Lunken Flight Training Center, and he says he'd love to teach full-time, but still has that day job for a few more years. Justin Winter, who brokers real estate on Lake Keowee in South Carolina, and someone wrote to me recently that I'm saying that incorrectly, so I apologize to the folks in South Carolina. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation. They have 2 Cessna T240 aircraft, and they've got a 2021 Piper M350 on order. Johnny McDade, he's a singer-songwriter, musician, and record producer. Jim Goldfuss is a commercial pilot, currently training for his CFI II and MEI at Republic Airport on Long Island, New York. He's also teaching as a ground instructor at Pilot Proficiency International. So if you need any help from a ground instructor, you can reach out to him on his Facebook page, Ground.9, and he can help you in person, online, or through Zoom. Vincent Salimi, he's vice mayor of the city of Pinole, California. He's the owner of Salimi Construction Management in San Francisco and president of the Concord Flying Club, the oldest continually operated club west of the Mississippi. Jim Hopp, he's a CFI and teaches at Advantage Aviation here at the Palo Alto Airport in Northern California. Joseph Sheehan, who flew in the Navy for 8 years. He now has a couple of hundred hours in his new Vision jet. Josiah Freeman, working on his instrument rating. Dylan Caldwell, he's an AME giving physicals for the Basic Med first, second, and third class physicals at the Naples Municipal Airport in Florida. You can reach him at aviatorsclinic.com. In his spare time, he tows gliders in a Piper Pawnee. And William Birch donates to the show in the memory of his son, Lieutenant J.G. Wallace Birch, who was a naval aviator. Don Hakela with Professional Instrument Courses. They conduct 10-day instrument courses, IFR Finish-Up, and IFR Refresher courses. You can find them at iflyifr.com. Don Dillman, he's a professional pilot who runs an airline flight department. He's also a CFI, flies a Bonanza, and he's a brand new Cirrus CSIP instructor. Rick Mattis flies a Cessna 210 out of Fort Worth Meacham Airport in Texas. John Tosto is an attorney from Flint, Michigan, and a member of the Greater Flint Pilots Association, and co-owner of a Cherokee 6. John recently received his instrument rating. Vic Bajaj, who's a client of mine, and we fly his Cirrus from time to time in the San Francisco Bay Area. Mark Holzbach lives in southwestern PA. He's a longtime aviation enthusiast. He wants to get his private when he retires in a few years, and he runs bodandsteel.com, which manufactures industrial fasteners. Tim Crawford, he flies a DA-40 out of Crosswinds Aviation at the Oakland County Airport north of Detroit. He runs a company called BrainSpring that helps children with dyslexia. Greg Van, we've had him on the show. He's a senior AME at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and he's the host of the Mayo Clinic Clear Approach podcast, which discusses medical issues for pilots. James Kerr, he's thinking about buying an SR20 for business travel. His company makes security screens for protecting your home, and you can find out more at bosssecurityscreens.com. Orel English, he's a CFI and II at the Westchester Flying Club at the Westchester County Airport in New York. He and a friend have created a website to make free flight planning modern and fast. The site is called flyway.cc, and you can check it out on the internet. Ed Kelly flies a Saratoga out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, and he says his 2-year-old son, Bennett, is the best co-pilot he could have. Jeff Brausch, who's a supporter of the show. Michael Ron, he runs a small wealth management firm in The Woodlands, Texas, which you can find at thesumplanning.com, and he's thinking about buying a Cirrus. Todd Cussell lives in Arizona and flies an SR-22 TG5. Chris Carnahan, he's the president of Boone Valley Forest Products and flies a VTEL Bonanza out of the Spirit Airport in St. Louis. Marlon Dutra works in Tech in the Bay Area and flies an SR-20 G6. Richard Clark plans to start instrument training in the fall, and he's about 18 months into the build of a Vans RV-14, and he hopes to have first flight by the end of the year. Sean Couch, Greg Campbell, and John Sadak, who we talked about earlier. My thanks to our mega supporters and to all of you who support the show in whatever way you do. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.